Hi, and welcome to this live stream on Webpianoacademy. My name is Antonella Di Giulio, and I am the founder of this channel. I create all the contents. Today, it is my honor to have here with me Professor James Currie. Professor James Currie was one of my professors for several years at the University of Buffalo. He's an associate professor of music and historical musicology at the University of Buffalo, and Dr. Currie is also a writer, a performer, and his works have been concerned with articulating the points of interaction and dislocation between music, history, philosophy, and politics. And let me welcome Dr. Currie here. Just a second, I removed this thing from the stream. Hi, welcome.
How you doing?
So let's talk a little bit. I think it is always interesting to know how we end up doing what we are doing right now. I think that all the things that we do in this moment are the result of the path that we've gone through our entire life. And then if we are at a certain point, it is because of all sort of influences that we have had, maybe by chance in our entire life. So how did your musical career start, and how did you end up being so interested in music?
I mean, there's kind of quite a lot to say about that, actually. I mean, and it's slightly complicated, you know, because my history is now quite long. I mean, I'm 52 years old, right? And so I've been studying and teaching beyond the level of an undergraduate for 30 years, right? So, I mean, I have a kind of a long history to it. But the initial means by which I got into it was I was a viola player, and that was what I was going to do. In fact, I was a professional for a moment, and I was going to go off to Music Academy and do that, not to do anything particularly academic at all. But I am quite academic, nevertheless, and so my parents thought it might be better to go to university. I mean, no one in my family had been to university before, right? I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and so they, because they didn't know anything either about universities or about being a professional musician, right? Come from a low middle class, working class background. So they thought it'd be better to go off to university, and they were wowed by the idea that I might be able to go to Cambridge, which is where I went because I'm from the UK, and you know, in those days Cambridge was free, so you know this was a great opportunity. So I kind of ended up doing two things at once as an undergraduate. I was both doing this sort of very traditional academic degree at Cambridge, but I was also then going down to London to have lessons at the Royal Academy, and also with the, at that time, well, I think he still is, the viola player of the Endelian Quartet, who was my viola teacher. So that went on, but during the course of my undergraduate degree, for a number of reasons, and just after, I basically gave up the viola for a series of quite complicated reasons, which ultimately I think was probably a good idea. But then didn't, you know, have anything particular, you know, I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I thought, I mean, you know, really it was not particularly directed. I just thought, oh, maybe I'd do a PhD, right? You know, I mean, exactly the kind of lack of forethought that I now criticize my graduate students if they haven't thought about, well, why are you doing this, right? So I applied to graduate schools. I was going to do my PhD in London at King's College, and I had that all set up. And then somebody said, well, I mean, you know, like in the States, they give you a lot of money. You know, they give you some money, right, to go and do these things. So I applied. And
I might disagree with that, though.
Right. Well, actually, yeah, even then, I mean, people like to think that it's only now that graduate students can't afford to live on their stipends. I mean, I went to Columbia and there was no way that you could live on that money. So I ended up in the States, you know, and again, it was sort of like kind of a joke. I was just like, oh, that would be nice. You know, New York seems like it would be fun. So there was sort of actually a series of quite flippant things that led me to finding myself, you know, studying for a degree. And I guess what I was seeking for was something, and it didn't necessarily even have to be about music, to be honest. I was looking for some kind of venue for being able to articulate questions that I felt were important for, very old-fashioned in a way, questions that I thought were important for me trying to understand what my life was about and what the meaning of my life was about. So the music was frankly a ruse.
Right.
And it still is to this day. As you know, Antonella, I have a quite extensive multi-arts practice, none of which involves music. I'm a performance artist and an installation artist, right? And a visual artist, in fact, not a musician at all. So the music, I care about music and I like writing about it and I like thinking about it, and it's been my job, right? But it's really often a means for me to try and get at other things. And so on that level, although I collect a paycheck for being a musicologist, I wouldn't actually say that I am one. I would say that I'm an intellectual. And I don't mean more intelligent. I just mean I use my erudition to address normative problems within a discursive field.
Yeah, I think that is the definition I would give to you. As instead of professor of musicology, I would just say he's an intellectual, rather than.
Most musicologists probably don't remember that I'm a musicologist anymore either. So I have a quite distant relationship to these things. And as you know, I've kind of presented. I started off actually doing my PhD in music theory, and more recently have written stuff predominantly for music theory venues. So it's kind of
at the very end, the two things. I don't think that two things should be separated, from each other. Like musicology and music theory is it seems like music theory is a difficult part of, and musicology is the easiest part. And then if you combine them together, then you have something that it is really kind of important. But if you separate them, then it seems like they don't really kind of. At times there's this disconnect between music theory and musicology, and then you don't know why a music theorist is doing something and a musicologist is doing something else. So I was intrigued by your article, the chapter actually of the book. So today we are talking about a chapter which appeared in Sound and Affect, which has been published by University of Chicago Press, and I will post the link in the description below. And the chapter's title was Life and Death of Daniel Barenmboim. And when I read the title and I was looking for topics for these interviews, I thought that I missed the death of Daniel Barenmboim, and I was like, wow, I missed that news. I don't know, I thought he was still alive.
He is.
And then I read the chapter, and I found it pretty interesting. At the end, you say that musicology should be part of musical life, and instead of Daniel Barenmboim in the interview that you analyze, and the kind of the things that they said in the interview that you analyze, seem almost to divide that. Can you? I'm sure that whoever is listening to this live stream doesn't know exactly what we are talking about because they didn't read the chapter. But I invite everybody who is listening to this live stream, to go ahead, buy the book, or kind of find the chapter. Yes, sure.
Yeah, there it is, right? It's got it.
Yes.
I guess you. Sound and Affect. So the volume Sound and Affect was it's not a conference proceedings, but it's a volume that grew out of a big conference on affect, and a sort of one of the first conferences in North America in musicological circles, but not solely, to deal with the influx of new theoretical and discursive and methodological writings about sound studies, and affect. And many ways,
could you explain to my viewer what do we mean with affect? So I guess everybody understands what sound is, but
well, I mean, both of them are tricky, right? You know,
yes.
sound studies is kind of interesting in that it takes the sonic sensory aspect of heard life in the most broadest sense. And so in that sense, sound studies, music studies is a subset to a certain degree of sound studies.
Right.
And there's been an interesting kind of sort of set of dialogues and competitions professionally between the two. I mean, you know, in many ways you could say that sound studies has attempted to take over from music studies and is in a certain way been much more successful about talking to other disciplines than music studies have, which are historically very bad at doing this. Affect, I mean, it is a kind of a $6 million question. What does affect mean? And whenever people start talking about affect, I always say, what do you mean? It can mean an array of things.
Right.
It can mean sort of emotion or something like that. But it also involves questions of intensity, force in perception, all of these kinds of things. So it's actually a pretty nebulous term and kind of quite difficult to sort of get one's head around. I mean, we use the term as part of a different word when we say something is affective. Right? You know, that it affects us in this way. So it's less a stable category of an emotion and more about the relationship between things affecting another one in this way.
Yeah. What happens when? You know, what happens when I listen to something?
So it's a tricky term, actually. My own relationship to it is primarily through the philosophical work of Deleuze, who basically says that one of the things he says about art is that the art is a form of affective intensification about, you know, sort of feelings and stuff about about things. So the conference sort of grew out of these things, and I presented at the conference. And what I was presenting on was, I mean, it's kind of interesting having just talked about my academic career as in a certain sense, having proceeded by a series of kind of chance things. I happened to go here, I happened to go to New York, I happened to do this, right? My own relationship to the Daniel Barenboim stuff is also, I came across by chance. And it's part of a larger set of project that I have in place, which has been to do with the work of Edward Said, and particularly the work of Edward Said in the last 10 years of his life. So Edward Said was a very famous Palestinian intellectual, politician, but also a professor of comparative literature at Columbia University and a very good musician. And he was very good friends with Daniel Barenboim. And I got into thinking about Edward Said also for rather chance reasons. I was waiting to get on an aeroplane, and bizarrely in the bookstore, there was a copy of the published conversations between Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim. I didn't have anything to read, so I picked it up and started reading it. And it wasn't necessarily that I thought that they themselves were saying something interesting, but I felt that there was something interesting about the conversations and what was sort of hanging around them. And so I then started writing. The last chapter of my book is on Edward Said. And then from that, you know, there came this stuff about Daniel Barenboim because they established this youth orchestra together called the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, right? To bring Eastern, you know, teenagers from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Levant together to perform music.
Right. Yeah, there's a conservatory. When I went to the West Bank a few years ago, I kind of visited the music school there, and so they established pretty good programs for kids.
It's a controversial endeavor, but it's an interesting one, and it raises a lot of questions that I've been interested in all the way through my intellectual life of thinking about music, which is the relationship between art and politics, which I kind of constantly feel is made a little glib in the academy, and I think it's actually much more complicated and often non-existent. So I got interested in it because it was a key place for it was a very interesting example to think about these things. So I've been writing about Daniel Barenboim and thinking about him, and I have a long-term project about Barenboim about Edward Said and Daniel Barenboim, and also the French author Jean Genet, who is also important to the story. So, I've been thinking about these things, and every now and again, somebody says, "Oh, will you come and talk?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, maybe I'll just develop this little thing here, that I've got going on." So the essay in the Sound and Affect volume is an essay about. It's really an essay about a lecture that Daniel Barenboim gave as part of the BBC Week lectures, which are held every year. This was after Edward Said had died, and Daniel Barenboim gave these series of lectures, which I think are called "In the Beginning Was Music" or something like that. Which are about his attempt to think about the relationship between music and politics and music and the world, and what we can learn from performing music and how that can help us to understand or behave or act better in the world. So he's really thinking about music as something important in and of itself, but also as music as a kind of pedagogical ground in which the skills that one can learn there can help one maybe in situations, maybe in situations of social antagonism, like in Israel and the relationship between Israel and the West, all of these kind of things. So the essay is kind of very close reading of some moments in this lecture that he gave at the BBC in 2006, I believe. And I then relate some of the things that Barenboim is saying about music to some of the key ideas about affect, which have been circulating, particularly, the philosopher Deleuze's notions of affect as art, as a kind of affective intensification. And I play off these two things off each other in order to think about questions of the, as it were, affective qualities of academic life itself, like how we are moved and how we feel and how we are kind of made more vivified or less vivified, how we are made to sort of feel more pleasured or excited by what we do as opposed to depressed, blah, blah, blah. So I use this to actually engage with thinking about what academic life is and whether academic life can somehow be like what I call musical life, i.e., what happens when you think about...
You divide, in the chapter, you divide the musical life from extra musical life. I was thinking, but I cannot see that dichotomy between like my musical life and my extra musical life, because that's music is everywhere in my life in some sort of way. So whether I'm listening, teaching, or kind of playing, or writing, or even interviewing you, it's just still about music. And then my life doesn't seem to be separated, between musical life and the extra musical life. So, and I was thinking,
but you're unusual in that way because you're a musician and you play and you're an academic. So the question where it becomes relevant is precisely when somebody thinks that, they have an aspect of their life that involves music. It might even be playing, or it might be listening, or whatever. And then, there's a distinction, and then they're doing sort of something else, right? And what I've always been interested in, and I come back to it again and again and again, is to the question of, well, can we make a distinction between what we do when we're doing music or musicking or whatever you want to call it, and when we're doing something else? And I think there are instances where they are two separate categories. And then there are other moments where we can think about them having a cross-fertilization with each other. And that's central. That thinking about where music and non-music is calibrated is central to practically everything I've done intellectually with regard to music for the past 25 years.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So Barenboim talks about music as an act of forgetting, right?
I've written about music as an act of forgetting, using Nietzsche and applying it to Barenboim.
Right. Yes.
Barenboim only talks about. In the BBC interview, he talks about the idea of forgetting in music as a negative thing, not as a positive thing. So he talks about it basically as that we use music to kind of forget about how miserable our life is. So it's like a classic thing, you know, you kind of come home from a long, I think this is the example you used, come home from a long day at work, and what you do is you pour yourself a drink and you put some music on in order to forget about what's going on, right? So it's a very literal.
Well, so he uses music as a sort of, oh, I'm taking a drink, get drunk, forget about life, or kind of, you know, something else, just forget about my life or how miserable I am.
Right. I mean, we would usually use the term escapist.
Yes. Right? Yeah. I know that, for example, when you do mindful meditation, all those types of things, they use sounds and music in order for you to stay focused on your life, in your life, instead of just forgetting about your life. So like when they do the, I don't know, this sort of meditations with Buddhist meditation with the bells, right? So the bell is the sound that reminds you to stay focused instead of just, you know, escape your life. So stay focused on your life and just, you know, think about where you are right now and in what part of the world you are right now, and think about your breathing, think about the fact that you're alive instead of just forgetting that you are alive. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, the meditation thing is an interesting example, right? And I mean, it has certain kinds of qualities. I mean, I think I would actually disagree with what you just said to a certain degree, because most meditation practices to some level are about, well, if we just go to about the most venerable text you could get with regard to this, which would be the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is the central text for Hatha Yoga, right? He says quite clearly, he or whoever, you know, the text is authored by, says quite clearly the process of yoga, which early yoga is not about poses and stuff like that. It's
of course,
meditation. He says that the process of yoga is essentially to calm the chatter of the mind. Right? So on that level, it's not so much a forgetting, it's an idea that, you know, in meditative practice, and it's useful for thinking about this in relationship to music, what we do is we kind of keep, something of us keeps stuck to the thought we have. So a thought goes by and we stick to it and go with it, right, in this kind of way. So what happens in the Patanjali is that the thought comes and you don't attach it, so I just kind of observe it and go this way. So there's both an acknowledgement of at least one's conceptual linguistic thinking life, but also a kind of an attempt to become indifferent to it. And the ultimate goal is that if you do that, at a certain point it disappears, right? So in a certain sense, what the meditation does is it does a paradoxical thing, right? By going in, the world essentially recedes, so it makes a kind of a clearing, we might say, which then paradoxically, if you practice this sort of clearing, which is sort of similar to forgetting, although not quite the same thing, it enables you to then subsequently be in life.
That was what I meant. Like, it's not escaping completely, you know, from life and just like, you know, forgetting about the fact that you're living. It's all about, you know, it is more about being present.
But it's interesting, right, that it's a progress, right? That it's not one or the other. It's just like, in order to be in life, you have to practice things that distance yourself from it. That's what's interesting to me, actually, to a certain degree, about what I think's interesting about music. And also meditation is that it's not just like you've got to be more in life, so you go into it. It's just like, no, in fact, to be in life, you have to somehow practice. I mean, meditation you could actually think about as a very profound art of indifference.
Right.
And I wonder sometimes if actually music doesn't function a little bit similarly. That if you think about, you know, you're a performer, right? That feeling, right? In order to perform, I mean, there's an audience there and stuff, but also if you only thinking about what's out there, you don't perform well, right? So there is this kind of sense that when we perform, we kind of make a clearing for ourselves. But then when that's done, when we go back into the world, we're sort of revivified in that way. So there is something kind of quite interesting about making space clearing things away actually allows you to then go back and be proximate with things. A distance is necessary for them to be a proximity.
Right. Yeah, when I perform, if I am mindful about what I'm performing, and I'm not being carried over for my performance, and I was like, oh, okay, I go with the sounds, and like, and I, really stay in control of my mind and of my thoughts while I'm performing. Then I perform actually better than if I'm thinking about the audience, what the audience is thinking, and I kind of let the thoughts go, right, with my performance. But now you posed the question in your chapter: who is Daniel Barenboim? Who is it?
Well, maybe a little bit background to why I posed that question, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm experimenting with intellectually and philosophically in the essay is a question which is very pervasive in modern Western discourse and has been for about the past 30 years, which is, when we talk about an I, I or a he or a she or, somebody else, what are we talking about, right? And for a very long time, when we say, who is Daniel Barenboim, we start talking about an identity. Right? He's this person, he does this, he lived in this place, this is where he's located, this is where he's contextualized, all of these kinds of things, right? But in modern intellectual culture, but also in sciences and stuff, I mean, in the past, quarter of a century, there's been a move to what we might call something that's a more post-humanist take on what we mean when we say who is Jamie Currie or who is Antonella Di Giulio or any of these kind of questions. So in the essay, I'm trying to kind of get the strangeness of how who we are can exist on a number of different levels of strata, which aren't necessarily synthesized, although they do interact. So on a humanist level, who I am is, I'm Jamie Currie and I have, mental agency and I'm British and I do this and I have this history and, my mother was this and my father was that, all of I live in Western New York, all of these things by which we map the person into place. But then if we go to a sort of a post-humanist issue, that sense of the sort of specificity of the individual dissolves and other things come out, other kinds of forces, other kinds of intensities, other kinds of abilities, other kinds of proclivities, other ways of using language, all of this kind of stuff. So in the essay, I'm kind of playing with sort of shuttling backwards and forwards. That on one hand, there's Daniel Barenboim, and if you're interested in Western classical music, most people know who he is. He's a famous conductor and pianist, and was at one time, married to the famous cellist Jacqueline Dupre, and all of this kind of stuff. Right? And yet, on the other hand, if we follow through on some of the things that he's saying in his lecture, Daniel Barenboim is also not a singular, unique person, but is this musician. And a musician is able to do certain things which are quite different from what we do just in our day-to-day life, right? So although I wouldn't say that, for example, when I'm Jamie Currie and then I go on stage to play the piano, I'm no longer Jamie Currie at all, right? But it is nevertheless the case that when I'm Jamie Currie, I'm trying to kind of balance this on the camera here, like when I'm Jamie Currie as an identifiable person, right? With a history and a name and whatever. When I go on stage, that goes down a bit, and who I am as a musician kind of comes up in a certain way. And I'm a different kind of person. I focus in a different way. I don't hold on to my sense of myself in that kind of way. So I'm very interested in how most artistic practices, in fact, make who we are when we're not doing them go down, and then there's something else come into play. And I don't think it's particularly mystical or anything like that. It's just a recalibration of the human animal at that moment to whatever it is, the formal organization and performance of sound, or the formal organization and articulation of visual space, or any of these things, right? And I'm very interested in, because that's what I've written about all my life, what's to be gained in those moments where we stop being less who we are in a humanist identity sense and more is in an artistic sense. So that's what I kind of mean by musical life and extra musical life. That our extra musical life is when I'm like in the supermarket or talking to my mum or whatever, right? But then my musical life or my artistic life is when something else of me is articulated, which is more dormant the rest of the time. So I guess, you know, there's two kinds of I mean,
there's always this. We always have these layers, right? So in the moment that I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm a music director in a church, I'm a teacher, I'm recognized for my artistic value and the artistic value that I bring to that place in that moment. But obviously, if I go to a piano teacher conference in school, I'm just a mom like everybody else, and it doesn't count that I don't know, it doesn't matter really kind of what I'm doing with my life, just a parent in that moment, or kind of I am somebody who's walking the dog on the street, or I'm a normal person, but all those layers are combined and they make us who we are.
I mean, here's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure, and we don't have to agree on this, right? You know,
no,
I'm not sure that they are combined. Now, one of the things, so on one hand, you know, I'm interested in, you know, how at certain moments I'm an artist more than I am Jamie Currie, and at other moments I'm more just Jamie Currie, as you say, doing all of these things, and I find that fascinating. So on one hand, I'm interested in that for reasons that have been inspired, or I've worked with contemporary theory on this level, you know, thinking about this. But the other source of this for me is the literature and artistic practices of from the late 19th century through to about, you know, through to basically 20th century modernist art. So, for example, at the moment, I'm rereading Proust, who is a great love of mine. And Proust is very fascinating precisely on this question that you talk about, and literally on the level of like walking the dog or being the mum at the teacher meeting, whatever. I mean, he sort of says that there's actually this bizarrely complicated array of different selves that we have, and they're definitely related, but they're very rarely combined or synthesized in this way, right? So for Proust, you know, what's fascinating about reading À la recherche de temps perdu is that as you go through it, you different characters, you see that he's sort of seeing them in different kinds of locations and doing other kinds of things. So the Duchesse de Guermantes, at one moment she's just like some lady chit-chatting at a dinner, and then the next moment, you know, he's thinking about her as, you know, this ideal that he has, and all of these things are true for him. And for Proust or for a modernist, these things flow in and out of each other, but we can never quite synthesize them at a certain kind of moment. And I think that's one of the things, I guess. I mean, it's interesting having this conversation because I've never quite articulated it like this before. I think my interest in, you know, who is a musician, these kind of questions, it's a great question that you asked actually, is actually quite deeply influenced by the fact that, you know, in my late teens and early 20s, I read all the modernist classics and was and they're very important to me. So Proust, Virginia Woolf, proto-modernists like Henry James, and to a degree Joyce. Joyce is not so personally important to me, but, you know, I was reading these people, and I still do read Proust and Virginia Woolf, pretentious as it may sound, regularly. And I think precisely because I'm fascinated by how at certain moments we activate something which is simply not activated at another moment, right? Dormant. And how these things, in the 19th century, they would have said, yes, as you said, combined, synthesized. But I think when we get to the 20th century, it's just like they're there, but you can't grasp them all at the same time. Anyway.
Right. Yeah, I think I had this same feeling when I was a performer before starting in music theory, when I was a performer, which I still am. But I always thought, I always heard from colleagues, I am a pianist, I am a true musician, I am. But then the truth is that only as a performer, only as a musician, you are just a musician at the moment that you practice, you go on the stage and you do all those things. But then, life is then full with many, many other things that might be combined in you being a musician, right? It might affect you, the way that you think about music and the way that you perform and you do all those other things. But then it doesn't mean that you, for example, I'm studying music theory and then having classes with you, that in the opera. I remember that the class that you taught. So you start thinking to music in a different way. So in that moment, I don't think I'm a performer anymore, right? So I'm just thinking about music, and then maybe I might combine that into my performances. But then at the same time, I'm just at a different level. So I was start thinking to music, and whenever somebody is saying to me, "Oh, I'm a true musician," I was like, "Yeah, you're a performer," but then there are so many aspects of music that you don't know, and that you might probably want to know if you really are interested in music in that deep way.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm very drawn on this level to certain anecdotes that one has about great artists or whatever, So, I mean, famous anecdotes that, like in between the acts of singing Tosca, Maria Callas was just in the dressing room eating potato chips, watching TV, right? And we all kind of, there's two ways of negotiating this. For some people, it's the idea of like, see, art's just, it's just rubbish. It's not real. It's all pretend. I find that argument tedious and teenage and doesn't interest me. What interests me is just like, it's not like, oh, when we see her eating the potato chips, watching TV, that's the real Maria Callas and the rest of it is bullshit, right? It's not that. It's actually, isn't it fascinating that with artists, if we use that term, they go in and out of this thing. And, Maria Callas was a very intelligent, fascinating person, but she's, and there's aspects of what we do as artists that then obviously do affect how we do other kinds of things. But there's also bits where there's just not really much communication at all. And I'm very interested by the fact that a perfectly, run-of-the-mill normal person, I mean, I do quite normal things. I'm not like some, there's things I do which I think can be impressive artistically, but, my day-to-day life, it's kind of a bit weird. And I'm sure, most people have had that experience, that they're like obsessed with the performer or whatever. And then you meet them off stage and it's kind of like, well, what's the big deal? It sort of seem like, like they just seem, like they're getting on with their life and they've got their quirks or whatever. Again, very good on this topic of like people that you idealize and then what they're like in real life, and the strangeness of the fact that their ideal aspect is true, but also their kind of material, kind of rubbish, normal day-to-day aspect is also true. And for Proust, I think that's the great mystery, and I think that I find that very touching, that a perfectly normal run-of-the-mill person, nevertheless, at certain moments, is able to be a Proust,
right?
Or a Daniel Barenboim or whatever. Daniel Barenboim, day-to-day life, when you see him being interviewed, is pretty annoying.
I don't know. I never met him, so maybe.
But I mean, if you've ever watched any of those things, I mean, he's kind of a bit pretentious, blah blah blah. But yet, he is also Daniel Barenboim, and he's a pretty amazing conductor. And so that mixture between things is really fascinating to me.
So when I talk to players, people that don't know much about music, and I maybe just enjoy music, just enjoy going to concerts, they have the impression that whoever is the conductor, whoever is performing on stage, knows as much about music in general, music history, music theory, and they know all those things. And I know for a fact that this is not true, because when I talk to my colleagues, then at times I'm astonished myself, like, how don't they know this? But then, if you spend your 8 hours at the piano performing, practicing the piano, then obviously, how much time do you have to read an academic article or a book? Then obviously you don't have the time. Probably are so tired that you don't want to read that. And at times we mix the two things. They are not the same thing. Performing an instrument, yes, requires a certain kind of knowledge. Obviously, if I'm performing Beethoven, I have to know, type of style that I'm performing, the type of language that I'm kind of adopting in that, or the type of articulation that I need to perform Beethoven in a right way. But then that doesn't mean that I know everything about that composition, or it doesn't mean that I know exactly how to analyze that piece, or it would help, but it is not necessarily combined. So the two things are not necessarily combined. And then probably that in music departments, we don't combine the two things really perfectly together most of the time. So.
That's a matter for a comic novel about institutional life, right? I think that's a really interesting point, and it does raise a certain anxiety about the fact that both yourself and myself, we're both, part of one of the things that we do in the world is that we are what called academics, right? And so we work in relationship to institutions, right? And institutions are full of people who are, aligned with disciplines, and institutions and disciplines are constantly justifying their relevance. Right. And one of the things that, and I think this is kind of brilliant that you bring this up. So one of the things that music departments and academic musicians, music theorists and musicologists, they get very anxious that people might think that they're not relevant. It's not to do with real music. Right. And so they say, well, actually, if you know these things, like, as you said at the beginning, hypermeter or whatever, that will help you perform better. And it's kind of like my response to that is just like, it might. But there are plenty of extraordinary performers who, they know something about the style, or they may have erudition, all these kind of things. But it's not, there's no necessary equation from the need for conscious knowledge about something and the ability to be a good performer or a good composer or a good artist or any of these things, So it is very interesting on that level that one of the things that your point raises for me, and this is something I've also, as you know from another piece I think that you read of mine, I'm very interested in at the moment. I think, academics are sometimes a little bit disingenuous about what they're doing, right? So they say, well, the reason I'm studying this is because it's necessary to know these things in order to appreciate the music better. And I'm just kind of like, I don't know if that's true or not. I think the reason academics do these things is, yes, they care about music or whatever they're studying and writing about, but really what they care about most is thinking about that, right? As opposed to performing it or whatever. And that's, so really what's interesting to me about music theorists and musicologists is not actually that it's about music, it's actually that it's about thinking about music. What kind of person becomes somebody who gets caught up into the pleasures, we might even say affective pleasures, to go back to the beginning.
It's almost an obsession about things.
Right. We all know that feeling, right? That there's a pleasure to sitting down by yourself with a book and the computer and crafting sentences, and you make this whole little bubbly world around yourself, which in its immediacy is not relevant at all. It's actually kind of quite animal. It's like making a little nest, and the thinking is exciting, but you're, from outside, it looks like you're doing absolutely nothing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that that's interesting in the same way that it's interesting to me that somebody who's might be just sort of perfectly tedious in day-to-day life might be an extraordinary pianist. Like, how is that? Why does a person, what is it in the human animal that makes somebody do these things, So I'm very, I'm very, I would say interested, but I think it's actually, I'm very touched by the fact that the human animal does these things, like becomes somebody who's a musicologist or a music theorist, or becomes a music performer. But I don't like to think about what I do academically as being like some kind of service industry for performers and composers. I mean, it's also a thing in and of itself. So if somebody says, why do you do musicology? My answer is actually tautological. My answer is, I do musicology in order to do musicology because it pleases me to do so.
Yes. Yes.
It's not a very popular answer in the States, right, where there's a great sense of pragmatism. But both you and I are Europeans, and we're kind of a little easier with that as an idea, you know.
Yes.
So, but I mean, that's another question about culture.
I mean, no. Why do you do philosophy? It's not that we want to solve the problems of the world. We want to create a new religion, or we study philosophy just because we are passionate about, understanding things our own way and finding an answer to some questions. And I think the same
pragmatic things, absolutely. But I think if we're just being really honest, the most immediate level on which it happens is one does philosophy to do philosophy. It's like a proclivity, like a tendency that you have as a certain kind of human animal that you can't stop doing it, right? And I like to think about different humans sometimes. I have friends and they have names and I think about them as identities, but I also kind of have another way in which I think about humans as the humans I encounter, my friends or otherwise, as people who are calibrated with different proclivities. And I find that very touching, that we have different things that we bend towards in order to sort of weave a little kind of place of like a little habitation for ourselves.
Right. I thought about music theory always like solving a crime, right? So you have this piece of music and you say, I want to know how that's structured, how those things are combined together, how did they put together? But the fact that I analyze somebody else doesn't give me the power to be a composer myself, because I don't have those ideas. I don't know how to do those things together. I don't know how to put those things together. I can only observe, analyze, and find out how somebody else did it. But at the same time, I cannot say I'm a composer, because I cannot come up with this idea. I can copy their ideas. It's not my job to do that. I'm not interested in doing that. So, and while a composer is interested in doing that and finding out how to put those things together, my job as a music theorist or as a musicologist is just to investigate those things and say, oh yeah, but because I'm interested, not because it is useful to anybody then at the very end, right?
Right. And I think that's a really, really important point. And we can sort of turn it around, because sometimes, as you know, like, I mean, I love teaching, it's something I like to do, but sometimes, you're in a seminar and a composer says, well, I mean, that's got nothing to do with what I was thinking about when I was making it. It's just like, well, so what? That doesn't invalidate it, right? It's kind of two ways of approaching. Sometimes a composer can read some theory and stuff like that, and that's an integral part of what they're doing. And then sometimes they read the theory and it goes, well, that I don't recognize that. But when they don't recognize it, that doesn't invalidate the intellectual activity, and vice versa, right? It's like when the intellectual activity can be shown to help performance, that's a big theme in music theory, right? Like analyzing performance and blah, blah, blah. And everyone says, and this is great because it connect with the reality of music and all this kind of rubbish, right? I'm kind of like, well, it's good if it does, but it's not the only good it can do. It can also be this sort of act of slowing down, contemplating, being with something for a very long time. I mean, how, the world is full of people not doing that. So isn't it interesting that, as you say, like, music theory or music analysis or even musicology can make you spend months with one movement of one Mozart string quartet. And not even as a performer would you spend that amount of time with the thing.
Right. And Mozart probably wrote it in a few days, right?
There's something incredibly historically moving about that slowing down and dwelling that can come from these activities. And what the good of that is, maybe a question for another conversation. But, but I do think it has value, and I think it is, if we allow ourselves to do such things, a little bit like the meditation thing you were talking about, Antonella, I think it is good for the human animal.
Right. Yes. I conducted a workshop on the Galant style, on sort of music in the Galant style, on those things. And in this workshop, that we realized that many of the things that a composer might do that were kind of, that we analyze as schema, and patterns in music, they were so unconscious to them that they didn't even realize that they were using them. And I think in the same way, if I give if I give a pattern to one of my students, and say, okay, I'll try to improvise on this piece, the only things that they can use, maybe unconsciously, as what they know and what they have can re-elaborate. I mean, at the conscious level, they don't know. They don't know what they're doing. They don't have the schemas in mind. So they just like, oh yeah, it sounds good that way. It sounds good that way. It sounds good that way, because they know, they have been influenced by their environment, the music that they've listened or they've studied to end up music on a tonic. They don't know that on a conscious level when they are 6, right? They don't know the names. They don't know what it is. They just feel it. It's right to end it that way. And I think for many composers, that's they feel, oh, I'm doing that because I feel it, because I thought about that. But then at the very end, then they are kind of influenced by their environment. So they're combining things without knowing. And then as a music theorist or as a musicologist, what you do is just bring back that kind of their conscious to a conscious level and say, oh, okay, see what you did? You did this way. It's almost like being a therapist. I'll say that, right?
That's very nice. I like that a lot. I mean, I'm not a composer, but I have, I have, quarter of a century of artistic practice, right? And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my experience of making in an artistic sense, or to use the sort of ancient term of poien, right? Like poem is making, right? In the sense, whether it's poetry or writing I've written librettos, and I also make, installations and stuff, is what I often say to people, because, they want you to say, what does it mean, right? And I'm like, look, I mean, really, when I make, what I feel at the end of having made something as an artist is roughly as follows. I am the person who has been most intimate with it, right? Because you're so inside it, and you're kind of like moving around in this kind of way. But I'm not necessarily the person who has the most knowledge of it, because knowledge is a distancing device. We stop something, we look at it like this. So when you're in it, you're absolutely right. I mean, my experience is, I'm not even that excited usually when I'm doing it, but I'm so in the details, and they're all in my mind, that I'm just kind of moving along, and it's actually kind of like, and then you sort of look up and you're like, okay, right, yeah, that's done. And it actually sort of feels to me like kind of quite like nuts and boltsy. And then somebody comes in and like, oh my God, that's like, they have an affective reaction, right? And they're like, what's it about? And I was just kind of like, well, I guess, I said, well, I was sort of thinking about this. And then, as you say, like psychoanalysis, then it tumbles out. But whilst I'm doing it, I personally, as an artist, I'm not that conscious of it. I've got bits and bobs in my mind, but it's, if somebody could hear those bits and bobs, they'd think it was a bit inane.
Right. It just doesn't like when you've been through a traumatic experience and you behave in a certain way just because of the traumatic experience. You don't know what triggered that at the beginning until you bring it out. So and I would say, have you had that? Maybe, or maybe what were you thinking about? And then you have to articulate that into something that this has a meaning. So when we do this type of work, then that's what we do actually, right? Because the composer is bringing out whatever they kind of experiencing, whatever they want to compose, whatever they think it is right, whatever they are thinking about the sounds. But then at the very end, then they don't really kind of, I don't think they are thinking about meanings and kind of all these other things that we discuss about.
Right. And I also think, it's kind of interesting, right? So if we say do a music analysis or something, we show, look, all this stuff is here. Even if we could show that it has nothing to do with the composer's intention, which is an almost impossible thing to prove, by the way, because we know post-Freud that we're not just as we appear. We have layers of different, levels of consciousness and thinking and blah, blah, blah. But even if we could say, well, actually, this analysis by Alan Fort of this piece of Schoenberg has actually nothing to do with how Schoenberg actually wrote it. I'm again like, I don't care about that, because I think it, to me, shows something more important, which is quite different to non-artistic forms, which is that, isn't it fascinating that this one sort of thing, which we can sort of articulate, this piece or that work of art, can generate so many responses, whether they're intentional or not. So one of the things I think that is proven by the academic or intellectual contemplation and study of an art form, is the very fact of art's generosity. That it allows all sorts of people to have a relationship with it who, when they're not relating to the work of art, probably do not agree at all, right? And that to me is something very, very fascinating about the work of art. And personally, I feel that, academia could kind of market that a little better. Just to sort of, I mean, since we started by talking about Barenboim. Barenboim is quite interested in that question. He doesn't theorize it very interestingly, but one of the reasons for founding the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, the Middle Eastern Youth Orchestra, which you spoke about, was precisely that he says, it is interesting that people with radically different backgrounds can nevertheless have a relationship with the same Beethoven symphony. So somebody who's, in, complicated situation in the West Bank, blah, 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 and somebody who's like a sort of Israeli Zionist nationalist, blah, 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 can nevertheless play the same piece at the same time. And I think any of us who've been orchestral musicians, and I was an orchestral musician.
Maybe play together and sing.
Right. I mean, the orchestral musicians famously, when they're off stage, don't get along with each other. Brass players are like different animals. And yet we can all do this thing when the piece of music is happening. But then when the piece of music stops, we go into other aspects. So it's, again, this thing about who are we when the art isn't there? It's a very interesting question. Whether we can use that to create better things is, the jury is out on that. Lots of people say, yeah, if we do that, we'll all come together and we'll have a better world. I think it's a little bit more variable.
Right,
that's possible, right? A Nazi and a Marxist can actually be in the same room when they're listening to a certain piece of music that they both like, even though their political beliefs are completely antagonistic.
Yeah. So I think a piece in this type of world, a piece is impossible just because of those differences that we will never come back. I mean, we are working on peace, being peaceful since centuries. We never achieved that. Right. Professor Currie, what are your projects for the future?
Well, at the moment, I'm finishing writing a book that's going to be coming out from Duke University Press, which is not a music book. It's actually a book that's coming out in a public intellectual series that Duke University Press is bringing out. Well, hopefully it'll come out if they accept it. But they've solicited it from me. So it's a series called Practices. And a friend of mine who is the series editor knows me as a performance artist, not as a musician or as a musicologist, and asked me to write a book for this series on practices on doing nothing. So I'm actually at the moment finishing, it's a short book, it's like a long essay really, on doing nothing. Although weirdly, reading the Barenboim in preparation for talking to you today, I realized that actually doing nothing is things that don't do things is a recurring theme in my work. So I'm kind of slightly moving to the side on that level. And then the other thing that I'm working on, which is more strictly musicological, is or more closely musicological, is I had a reading group which met just simply to read with a group of friends of mine, the music theorist Roger Grant, the music theorist / musicologist Stephen Decatur Smith, musicologist Daniel Viegas. We had this reading group on mimesis and opera and comedy. And a journal remembered that we were working on this and was asked us to put together a collection of the journal based on this. So I'm going to be working on an essay about Mozart, because many people forget, myself included, that I started out as somebody, I wrote a PhD on Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven.
Awesome.
Right. So I'm going to be writing something about Mozart opera.
Beautiful.
Very excited about it. So I'm very lucky, I get to both do my musicological work and also have these other intellectual projects which are branching out. And then
I will read the Do Nothing book.
Right. No. So those are what I'm working on at the moment, and I also have an artistic practice that I'm making installations at the moment. So I have sort of 3 things going on.
I know you always have so many things going on. That's awesome. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for this live stream. I will post all the links in the description of this video. And so I hope you will have a wonderful semester.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always kind of really wonderful to have the opportunity to articulate outside your head the things that you're doing, and it's actually always very helpful. Like, oh, I'm doing this. I didn't really know that before.
And I think for many people out there, it's important to see what you do in the university, because many don't really know your work, and they don't have access to this type of information. So I think it is very important for everybody out there to have access to this information for free.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, no,
price.
It's really wonderful that you do this, and I'm very grateful and honored that you asked me to speak.
Thank you so much, and to the next. Bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.